What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. One of the most common questions I get asked is, how long does it take to find bass offshore? In the past, I would respond that it varies by lake type, season of the year, skill level, and so on. But today, I decided to use data from over 100 fishing trips to determine how long it should take you to find offshore bass and the steps you need to take to make it happen. Let's get into it. The first question that needs to be answered is, how long, on average, does it take to find and catch an offshore bass? To do this, I pulled the video recordings from over 100 of my personal fishing trips and timed how long it took me to catch my first bass offshore on each trip. To make the results more realistic, I only looked at trips I took to lakes or sections of lakes I'd never been to before. This means I had no prior experience in that area of the lake and couldn't use spots I've caught them on in the past to speed up the process. In addition, I only used trips when I was exclusively fishing offshore. This left me with 60 fishing trips to analyze. Across all these trips, I found it took me about 3 hours on average to catch my first offshore bass. Again, I had no prior knowledge of the areas I was fishing, so it took a while to find an active group of offshore bass. One thing I did consider when collecting my data was the size of the lake and the season I was fishing. On average, I found bass 1 hour faster on a small lake, which I defined as being less than 1 mile long, than on a medium or large size lake. In addition, I found bass 1 hour faster on average during the springtime, and 1 hour slower during the wintertime. I wouldn't put too much weight on these results though, because I'm working with a very small sample size. Nonetheless, regardless of the season or lake size, it still took me a minimum of 2 hours to catch my first bass when I had no prior knowledge of a lake or section of a lake. Next, I wanted to determine how I was using those 2 to 3 hours to find and catch offshore bass. Through more video analysis, I found that in the 3 hours between starting my day and catching my first bass, on average I spent 2 hours graphing with my fish finder, 20 minutes driving between areas, and 40 minutes fishing. This means when I'm searching for bass offshore, I usually spend 78% of my time driving my boat and 22% of my time actually fishing. Now you might say if I spent more time fishing, I would catch a fish sooner. However, this is not the case when you're fishing offshore for bass. When fishing offshore, you don't have any visual indicators of where fish might be. In contrast, when you're fishing down the bank, you can see visible targets that might hold bass, like bushes, shallow grass, or boat docks. This means you can see where you should be casting, making it more efficient to spend your time fishing rather than driving your boat. However, when fishing offshore, the only way to find cover, unless you already know it's there, is to graph it with a fish finder. By using side and down imaging, you can find offshore cover, mark it with a waypoint or marker buoy, and then make a cast on it. Now you could obviously just start casting randomly in the middle of the lake as well, hoping you hit something, but this is not very efficient. As a result, you're going to waste some time graphing for cover when fishing offshore, and you need to make that time up elsewhere, otherwise there's no point in fishing off the bank. The way that I make up this time is by using my fish finder to identify bass, so I know that when I make a cast, it's around a bass. If you're struggling to identify bass in a fish finder, or need help learning how to use one, I'll leave a link in the description of this video to a series of free electronics instructional videos that I've made on this YouTube channel over the past 4 years. They include basic sonar interpretation instruction, how to set up the settings in your fish finder, how to hit offshore structure spots, the best baits to use, and a lot of other great information. One important call out is that even if I do see bass in my fish finder, it's not a guarantee that I'll catch them. Again, using my video recordings, I found that I fished 4 spots on average before catching my first bass. If you recall, I found that I spent 40 minutes on average fishing during my 3 hours of searching. If I fished 4 spots in 40 minutes, this means I only fished each area for roughly 10 minutes apiece. This is something I figured out years ago, and I now do intentionally. I estimate that 85% of the time, I'll catch a fish within the first 10 minutes of fishing an offshore area, and often get bit on my first, second, or third cast on the spot. Therefore, I'm not going to waste time fishing a spot for 30 minutes, even if I see bass on the spot with my fish finder. Instead, I'll make between 6 to 9 casts with 2 to 3 different fishing lures and then move on. The lure I chose is based on how bass are positioned on my fish finder, and I made a great video about this topic a few weeks ago that I would highly recommend you check out. Again, if I don't get bit in my first 6 to 9 casts in an area, I'll move on to try to find a new area. Now, to be clear, just because I didn't get bit on this area doesn't mean there are no bass there. On the contrary, a lot of times I see bass on a spot with my fish finder but don't get them to bite. This might happen because the bass are not actively feeding at the moment I pull up on that spot, or I haven't found the right bait to get those fish to bite. You may be able to rotate through 10 to 15 different baits and finally find one bait they'll bite. However, this may take 30 to 40 minutes and usually will only result in 1 or 2 fish catches. When bass are not actively feeding, you basically have to force feed them into biting, and it's very rare that I will activate a school after 30 or 40 minutes and then proceed to catch 20 or 30 bass. Instead, I'll use that same amount of time to find another group of bass that may be actively feeding, and if they are, I'm going to catch 3 to 10 bass out of that school very quickly. These are the areas that I usually get bit on with my first or second cast. With all these data points, I was able to create a timeline of what my average offshore fishing scouting session looks like. The exact times will vary day to day, but hopefully the takeaway is clear. The biggest mistake new offshore fishermen make is not spending enough time graphing for bass with their electronics. Even if you're skilled with bass fishing electronics and have a solid understanding of offshore bass fishing theory, part of finding and catching offshore bass is putting in the time required to be successful. It also means that you're usually going to be driving your boat more than fishing when you first start looking for offshore bass. The good news though is that once you catch your first bass, it's usually a lot easier and faster to find a similar area because you know what you're looking for. It may only take 1 hour of idling to find your second spot and 30 minutes to find your third. It's even faster if you have prior knowledge of the lake you're fishing and have caught fish on specific spots in the same season in that exact section of the lake. This means your offshore success on a specific lake will increase as you get more familiar with where you're fishing. This makes it faster and easier to find new areas. But for those who are just starting their offshore fishing journey, or those who want to improve their skills at finding fish offshore on new lakes, here are a few tips based on the results I just found. The first is to start learning how to find bass offshore on smaller lakes. Let's say lakes less than 1,000 acres or no more than a few miles long. These smaller lakes have limited number of structure and cover spots offshore that the bass can set up on. This means that if the bass are offshore, you don't have to check a ton of areas until you start finding fish. This is great because you don't have to spend hours and hours graphing and idling to find those spots, and instead you can focus on dialing in your presentations, your baits, and learning your electronics. I learned to fish offshore on a series of lakes that were less than 1,000 acres in central Arkansas, and it really accelerated my offshore fishing skills because I was able to find fish relatively quickly, get some success early, and then expand on that as I went to bigger and bigger lakes. My second piece of advice is to start learning how to fish offshore on lakes with at least 2 feet of water visibility. In general, on lakes with less than 2 feet of water visibility, the bass are not going to set very deep offshore, maybe in 4 to 8 feet of water. This makes them very hard to identify with a fish finder. However, as the water gets clearer on your lake, let's say into the 3 to 5 foot range, those bass will set up offshore in 15 to 25 feet of water. These fish are a lot easier to identify on the down imaging on your fish finder, and you'll be able to pick out which spots have groups of fish on them much easier. Finally, when you're learning to catch fish offshore, you need to commit 100% to the offshore bite. One way I used to do this is only bring a handful of offshore lures in the boat with me, like a 3/4 ounce football jig and a deep diving crankbait like a Strike King 6XD. These baits are pretty tough to throw in shallow water, and it would force me to get off the bank and try to catch fish with those deeper fishing lures. Leave the shallow diving crankbaits, the buzz baits, and the Senkos at home, and just bring a few offshore lures that are tough to fish in shallow water, and you'll force yourself to learn that offshore game. And that's it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed and found it helpful. If you liked the video, I would really appreciate it if you left a like down below. It helps with the YouTube algorithm and gets this video out to more people. Also consider subscribing to the Fish the Moment YouTube channel to get reminded of all of our future uploads. Thanks again for checking out this video, and we'll see y'all in the next one.